When my children convinced me to temporarily move into a senior living facility after my minor hip surgery, then listed my historic Victorian home for sale without my knowledge, I didn't confront them or cause a family scene. Instead, I quietly called my attorney the night before signing their routine paperwork, transferring the property into a community housing trust that now provides affordable homes for retired teachers. While my stunned children had to explain to their country club friends why the lucrative real estate flip they'd been bragging about had transformed into a neighborhood revitalization project they never intended. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me where you're watching from today. And if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I'm sharing something that might just change how you think about family wealth and legacy forever. My name is Virginia Caldwell, and at 74 years old, I discovered that sometimes our most painful family disappointments can become catalysts for creating something far more meaningful than we ever imagined. For nearly 4 decades, I devoted my life to education, starting as a high school English teacher and eventually becoming the principal of Westridge Academy, one of the most respected public schools in our county. What began as a simple teaching position in 1972, when I stepped in mid-year after another teacher left unexpectedly, blossomed into a career that shaped over 5,000 young minds and established an educational philosophy that continues, influencing our district's approach to this day. In the early days, I worked endless hours in our modest bungalow's dining room, with Robert, my ever-supportive husband, helping with everything from grading papers to building classroom bookshelves. We saved every penny until we could afford the down payment on what everyone in town called the old Henderson place, a neglected but once magnificent Victorian home on Maple Street that had fallen into disrepair after sitting vacant for nearly a decade. That house became our life's project. Robert, with his remarkable carpentry skills and endless patience, spent weekends restoring ornate woodwork, repairing stained glass windows, and gradually bringing each room back to its original glory. I learned to refinish hardwood floors, repair plaster moldings, and research historical accuracy for each restoration decision. Our colleagues thought we were slightly mad, investing so much into a property most considered beyond salvation. "A house with history has character no new construction can match," Robert would say when friends questioned our seemingly endless project. These old homes were built to shelter generations, not just serve as temporary living spaces. The house wasn't just magnificent architecturally, it had history woven into every corner. Built in 1886 by Edward Henderson, one of the town's founding educators who established our first public library, it had originally served dual purposes. The grand front parlors and dining room were the Henderson family's private quarters, while the East Wing contained a community reading room where Henderson offered free literacy classes to factory workers in the evenings. This educational legacy was what had initially drawn us to the property, despite its intimidating state of disrepair. When we purchased the house in 1988, that East Wing had been partitioned into awkward rental units, its original 15-foot ceilings hidden by dropped acoustic tiles, its grand windows partially blocked by carelessly installed air conditioning units. Robert spent 3 years just restoring that section alone, meticulously uncovering original features while integrating modern systems that didn't compromise the historical integrity. "Look at this craftsmanship," he would marvel, carefully removing layers of paint to reveal intricate woodwork. These weren't just decorative elements, they were statements about what a community valued. No one builds like this anymore because few believe these details matter. By the mid-1990s, our Victorian had become something of a local landmark. The beautiful blue house on Maple Street where the principal lived, where student council meetings sometimes happened in our restored reading room, and where new teachers were welcomed each fall for an orientation dinner in our garden. The house became more than our home. It became a symbol of perseverance, restoration, and the belief that things of value deserve preservation, even when others see only their flaws or outdated features. During the school year, I would often host special tutorial sessions for struggling students in what we called the library, the restored reading room that now housed our collection of classic literature and educational texts. Something about the room's atmosphere, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable window seats, seemed to inspire even the most reluctant learners. Many former students later told me those sessions in the Henderson Library had been turning points in their educational journeys. A meaningful legacy isn't measured by modern convenience but by lasting impact, became my most quoted piece of advice, words I shared with countless students and younger colleagues over the years. This philosophy guided not just my educational approach, but our entire life, investing in things with permanence rather than chasing the newest trends or easiest paths. The irony that I would eventually be pushed out of this carefully restored home by my own children wasn't lost on me. After decades of teaching young people to value history, craftsmanship, and deeper meaning over quick profit or convenience, I found myself facing the ultimate betrayal when my son Michael and daughter Catherine decided my home of 36 years was simply an underutilized asset on a prime development lot that needed to be liquidated for proper estate management. Neither of my children followed me into education, despite my hopes that they might catch the teaching spark. From an early age, their interests pulled them in different directions. Michael showed an aptitude for mathematics and a fascination with business that eventually led him to pursue finance, gradually working his way up through investment firms until reaching a senior position at a prominent wealth management company in Chicago. Catherine, always artistically inclined but practically minded, became a real estate developer specializing in luxury condominium conversions in historic buildings, a career path that always struck me as ironic given her minimal interest in actual historical preservation. Had tried to instill in them our values about history, community contribution, and measuring success beyond financial metrics. During their childhood, they had seemed to appreciate our home and the stories behind each restored feature. Michael had even helped Robert rebuild the back porch balusters one summer during college, carefully matching the original design from faded photographs we'd found in the local Historical Society archives. Catherine had spent hours helping me restore the garden to its original Victorian design, planting heritage roses and creating gravel pathways that complemented the home's architecture. But as they entered adulthood and established their own careers, their values shifted noticeably. Success became increasingly defined by financial achievements and material acquisitions. Their visits home grew less frequent and shorter in duration. When they did come, they seemed almost uncomfortable among the carefully preserved historical elements they had once helped restore. "Mom, have you ever considered updating the kitchen?" Catherine asked during one Thanksgiving visit, eyeing our restored 1920s stove with barely concealed disdain. The vintage look was charming in the 90s, but modern buyers expect professional-grade appliances and open-concept designs now. "I'm not a modern buyer, dear," I reminded her gently. "I'm someone who appreciates the craftsmanship and design principles of an era when things were built to last generations, not until the next trend cycle." While Robert was alive, family gatherings maintained a comfortable balance. He had a natural, diplomatic ability that smoothed over the increasingly evident value differences between our generation and our children's more market-focused worldview. When disagreements arose about matters like whether certain original features of our home should be modernized, Robert found thoughtful compromises that respected both practicality and preservation. "The kids have different priorities, Ginny," he would remind me after particularly frustrating conversations. "Not better or worse, just different. They're navigating a world we didn't prepare them for, one that values financial expertise over craftsmanship and market position over personal meaning." He was particularly skilled at redirecting conversations away from property improvements toward the stories and history embodied in our home. When Catherine suggested replacing the original stained glass windows in the front parlor with energy-efficient modern replicas, Robert didn't argue about aesthetic value. Instead, he led her to the window and pointed out the artisan's signature etched in the corner, then shared the research he'd done on Wilhelm Schmidt, the German immigrant glassworker who had created these windows for the Henderson family in c. 1886. That's his actual signature, not a reproduction, Robert explained with the quiet enthusiasm that made his historical knowledge so engaging rather than pedantic. He created these in his workshop just 3 blocks from here, and his great-granddaughter still lives in town. She visited last year and was moved to tears seeing his work so carefully preserved. Those human connections to history often succeeded where direct arguments about preservation would have failed. Our children might not have shared our passion for historical conservation, but they could understand and sometimes even respect the personal stories that made these architectural elements meaningful beyond their material value. After Robert's sudden heart attack 5 years ago, these philosophical differences became more pronounced. What had been occasional suggestions about updating the Victorian to increase its market value evolved into increasingly direct conversations about whether the house was too much for me to manage and if I should consider more appropriate. Senior housing options. Initial visits after Robert's passing had been focused on genuine concern and support. Michael and Catherine took turns staying with me for the first few weeks, helping sort through practical matters and ensuring I wasn't overwhelmed by the sudden shift to widowhood after 47 years of partnership. But as months passed, their visits increasingly centered around asset discussions rather than emotional support. Catherine began bringing renovation magazines and real estate listings for luxury senior communities. Michael initiated conversations about my investments and whether the house represented an inefficient allocation of capital given its maintenance costs relative to its potential market value. "Mom, this house sits on nearly an acre of prime real estate," Catherine explained during a Sunday dinner last spring, speaking with the practiced patience one might use with a stubborn child. In today's market, developers would pay a premium for this location. That capital could be generating significant returns instead of being tied up in an aging structure that costs thousands in annual maintenance. What she conveniently ignored was that I had never viewed our home as a financial investment vehicle, but as the physical embodiment of our life's work and values. The aging structure she referred to had been lovingly restored by her father's hands over decades, hands she had held as a child while he patiently taught her the difference between oak and maple. The proper way to hold a chisel, the importance of respecting the original craftsman's intentions when restoring historical elements. Michael would reinforce these points from his financial perspective. "Dad would want your retirement to be secure. Mom, this house represents the bulk of your net worth, but it's not generating any income. It's actually creating negative cash flow with its property taxes and upkeep requirements." This particular argument stung most sharply because it invoked Robert's wishes in a way that fundamentally mischaracterized his values. My husband had poured his heart and countless hours into this home precisely because he believed some things held value beyond financial metrics. He had explicitly told both children, in my presence, that the house represented our legacy and should remain in the family or be dedicated to community purpose if neither of them wanted to maintain it. "Your father didn't measure life in portfolio returns," I reminded Michael during one particularly persistent discussion. He understood that some investments are measured in community impact and historical continuity, not quarterly statements. What neither acknowledged was how thoroughly this home represented not just financial value, but the physical embodiment of the life Robert and I had built together. Every restored banister, every carefully preserved ceiling medallion, every garden bed he had designed, all contained memories and meaning no balance sheet could capture. "I understand your concern," I would respond during these increasingly frequent conversations. "But this house isn't just property to me. It's 40 years of Robert's craftsmanship and our shared vision. The financial aspects are just one dimension of its value." Catherine would exchange that look with Michael, the one that silently communicated, "She's being emotional and impractical again." Then would come their well-rehearsed reassurances that they understood completely, followed immediately by renewed suggestions about at least exploring options for senior living communities. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time was how these conversations were merely the visible portion of a more coordinated strategy. Behind their concerned expressions and carefully framed suggestions lay specific plans already in development. Plans I would discover only when circumstances forced their revelation. The situation changed dramatically when I suffered a fractured hip after slipping on our back porch steps during an unexpected early frost. The injury wasn't catastrophic, a clean break requiring surgery but with excellent prognosis for full recovery. However, it created the perfect opportunity for Michael and Catherine to accelerate their plans under the guise of necessary medical care. The morning of my accident had begun like any other autumn day. I had risen early, as was my habit after 40 years of school administration, and gone downstairs to prepare my usual breakfast of toast and tea. Through the kitchen window, I noticed the garden's Japanese maple had turned a brilliant crimson overnight, a spectacular display that happened for only a brief period each fall. I decided to step out onto the back porch to take a photograph to share with my garden club. I didn't notice the thin layer of frost that had formed on the porch steps until my foot slipped and I fell awkwardly, landing with a sickening pain that immediately told me something was seriously wrong. Fortunately, I had my cell phone in my pocket and was able to call for help. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and I was quickly transported to Memorial Hospital, where X-rays confirmed a fractured hip requiring surgical intervention. While I was still in the hospital following surgery, my children presented what seemed like thoughtful preparation for my recovery. They had researched and secured a short-term stay at Oak Ridge Senior Living, a facility with excellent rehabilitation services and professional care during what my doctors suggested would be a 6 to 8 week recovery period before I could safely navigate stairs again. "It makes perfect sense, Mom," Catherine explained, her tablet filled with photos of Oak Ridge's well-appointed rooms and rehabilitation facilities. "You'll have professional physical therapy daily, nurses available 24/7, and no worries about managing the house during recovery." Michael added the practical considerations. "We've spoken with your insurance provider, and your policy covers most of the costs for the rehabilitation period. It's the most sensible approach to ensure proper recovery." Their presentation was comprehensive and seemingly motivated by genuine concern. The logic was difficult to dispute. The Victorian's master bedroom was on the second floor, requiring navigation of the grand staircase multiple times daily. The recommendation aligned with my doctor's advice about rehabilitation needs and precautions during recovery. "Just for the initial recovery period," Catherine emphasized, correctly sensing my hesitation. "Once you're cleared for stairs and more independent movement, you can reassess whether you want to return home or consider other options." The facility itself was undeniably pleasant, modern, clean, and staffed by kind professionals. My private room featured large windows overlooking a well-maintained garden, and the rehabilitation program was indeed excellent. During those first weeks, I focused entirely on recovery, working diligently with the physical therapists and following all medical recommendations to regain mobility as quickly as possible. Michael and Catherine visited regularly, always solicitous about my comfort and recovery progress. They brought favorite books, arranged for my bridge club friends to visit, and generally maintained the appearance of children solely concerned with their mother's well-being. If they occasionally mentioned how much easier life was with all these services provided, or how I didn't have to worry about home maintenance. During my stay, it seemed like natural observation rather than strategic reinforcement of their underlying agenda. The first signs that something beyond recovery planning might be underway came 3 weeks into my stay at Oak Ridge. During one of Catherine's visits, she casually mentioned that they had brought in a service to freshen up the house while you're away. Deep cleaning, minor repairs, that sort of thing. When I expressed surprise at this unnecessary expense, her explanation seemed slightly rehearsed. "It needed to be maintained anyway, Mom. And this way, Whenever you decide what you want to do next, the house will be in perfect condition, whether for your return or other options. That subtle emphasis on other options triggered my first serious concerns about their intentions. The following day, I asked one of the nurses if I could use the facility's computer to check my email, something I hadn't bothered with. During the intensive initial rehabilitation period, among the usual correspondence was a message from Eleanor Thompson, who had been my neighbor for over 20 years. Her casual mention of the work happening at your house caught my attention immediately. I was surprised to see the staging company arrive yesterday. The for sale sign hasn't gone up yet, but Catherine mentioned they're just preparing things in advance. I know this must be a difficult decision, but I wanted you to know we'll miss you terribly on Maple Street. I stared at the screen in stunned disbelief, reading and rereading Eleanor's message to ensure I wasn't misunderstanding. A staging company? Preparing for a sale? Without any discussion or consent from me? The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I initially struggled to process its implications. Further emails revealed other neighbors had similar impressions, all apparently from conversations with either Michael or Catherine, who had been freely discussing the upcoming sale of my home as though it were an established decision. Mrs. Abernathy from across the street mentioned the developer who walked the property yesterday, while Jim Kendall, whose family had lived next door for 3 generations, expressed concern about rumors that the property might be subdivided for multiple housing units. As the reality of what was happening became clear, my initial shock gave way to a cold, focused anger I had rarely experienced. This wasn't just presumptuous overreach by well-meaning children. This was a calculated plan to take advantage of my temporary physical vulnerability to override my clearly expressed wishes regarding my home. That evening, when Michael visited after work, I carefully avoided revealing what I'd discovered. Instead, asking seemingly innocent questions about the house maintenance, and when they thought I might be able to return home for a brief visit to check on things personally. His response confirmed my suspicions through its careful evasion and redirected focus. The doctor thinks another 3 weeks of rehabilitation would be ideal before even considering a home visit. And honestly, Mom, once you experience the conveniences, here, prepared meals, social activities, no maintenance worries, you might reconsider whether managing that big house alone makes sense anymore. When I pressed further about specific maintenance being done, his answers became increasingly vague. Catherine's handling most of that. You know how she understands property matters. The important thing is focusing on your recovery right now. After he left, I requested a private phone call from my room, contacting my longtime friend and attorney, Margaret Wilson. We had met during my 2nd year of teaching when her son was in my English class, and our friendship had deepened over decades of community involvement and mutual respect. She had handled Robert's will and all our legal matters for over 30 years. Margaret, I said, after briefly explaining the situation, I need to know exactly what rights my children have regarding my home while I'm temporarily in rehabilitation. And I need absolute discretion, no calls to them to discuss the situation or clarify intentions. Margaret's response was immediate and clear. Without your signature on power of attorney documents or property transfer paperwork, they have absolutely no legal right to sell your home or make any significant decisions about your property. Period. Are you suggesting they're attempting this? I believe preparations are already underway, I explained, sharing the emails from neighbors and the suspicious conversations. They seem to be operating under the assumption that my temporary physical limitation equals diminished decision-making capacity. The concern in Margaret's voice was evident as she promised to investigate discreetly and visit me the following day. Make no commitments to anything they present to you, she advised firmly. Not even seemingly routine paperwork. Tell them you need time to review everything carefully, which is absolutely your right. The next morning, Catherine arrived unusually early, carrying a portfolio of documents with an eagerness poorly disguised as casual conversation. "I brought some paperwork that needs your signature," she explained, arranging papers on my bedside table. "Just routine things to help us manage expenses and household matters while you're recovering." As I reached for the documents, I recalled Margaret's warning and instead asked, "Why don't you leave these with me to review carefully? I may be in rehabilitation, but my mind needs exercise too. I'll go through everything and have questions ready when you visit tomorrow." Catherine's momentary hesitation revealed volumes before she recovered with forced brightness. "Of course, though it's really just standard authorization forms, nothing that requires detailed review. But take your time." After she departed, I examined the documents to find exactly what I had feared: power of attorney forms that would grant them complete control over my financial and property decisions, presented alongside mundane medical release forms as though equally routine in nature. When Margaret arrived that afternoon, her expression upon reviewing these documents confirmed the severity of the situation. "This is far beyond inappropriate," she stated, her professional calm barely containing obvious anger. "These would grant them complete authority to liquidate your assets without further consent. And buried in this seemingly innocuous health directive is language that would designate Oak Ridge as your permanent residence. They're planning to sell my home while I'm recovering from a temporary injury," I said, the reality of this betrayal finally spoken aloud between us. "Yes," Margaret confirmed, "and based on what I've discovered through discreet inquiries, they're not just planning, they're actively executing that plan. A real estate assessment has already been completed, and preliminary marketing materials are being prepared by Catherine's firm. The house isn't officially listed yet, but they're positioning it for a private sale to a development company, likely to avoid the public nature of a traditional listing that might alert you through concerned friends. The completeness of this deception, orchestrated by my own children while presenting themselves as concerned caregivers, created a unique kind of pain I had never experienced, even when losing Robert. This wasn't just disappointment, but fundamental betrayal of trust and relationship. "What are my options?" I asked Margaret, focusing on action rather than emotion. "Legally, you hold all the power here," she assured me. "Without your signature, they cannot sell the property or make any binding decisions regarding your assets. The immediate concern is ensuring you don't inadvertently sign anything they present as routine or necessary." As we discussed potential responses, an unexpected clarity emerged through my initial shock and hurt. This wasn't just about protecting my home from unauthorized sale. It was about the underlying values this situation revealed, about family obligation, about the treatment of elders, about whether historical preservation and community meaning mattered compared to market value and investment efficiency. Something Robert had said years earlier when we were restoring the house's original community room. Space Victorian homes, often included for neighborhood gatherings and civic meetings, resonated with new significance. This house was built when people understood that private property still served community purpose. The Hendersons didn't just build a home for themselves. They created space that benefited neighbors and strengthened local bonds. As Margaret and I explored legal options for protecting my property, a different kind of solution began taking shape in my mind. One that would address not just the immediate threat, but transform this painful betrayal into meaningful purpose aligned with my lifelong values. "Margaret," I said, interrupting her explanation of restraining orders and legal notices, "I want to discuss something beyond defensive measures. What would be involved in establishing a housing trust for the property?" Her expression shifted from protective anger to thoughtful consideration. "What kind of trust are you envisioning?" "Something that would preserve the house while repurposing it for educators who struggle with housing affordability," I explained, the concept crystallizing as I spoke. Robert and I always talked about how the property could serve educational purposes beyond our lifetime. Both the Henderson legacy and our own restoration work would be honored through continued connection to teaching and learning. Margaret nodded. Slowly, her legal mind already processing possibilities. A community housing trust with specific educational focus would be entirely feasible. The property could be structured to provide affordable housing specifically for retired teachers or educational professionals, with provisions ensuring its historical features remain protected from development or significant alteration. For the next hour, we outlined what would become the Caldwell-Henderson Community Housing Trust, a legal entity that would preserve the Victorian while repurposing it for affordable housing specifically designated for retired educators with limited pension resources. The main house could accommodate 4 separate apartments while maintaining historical integrity, and the carriage house could be converted into an additional dwelling unit. This approach addresses multiple needs simultaneously, Margaret observed as she made detailed notes. It preserves a historical property that would likely be demolished by developers, provides affordable housing in an increasingly expensive area, supports educators who often struggle financially in retirement, and creates community benefit aligned with both the Henderson legacy and your life's work. And, I added with what Margaret later described as the first genuine smile she'd seen since my accident, it ensures my children can't profit from disregarding my clearly expressed wishes about the property's future. As we refined the concept, practical questions arose about management, maintenance, and long-term sustainability. These weren't simply reactive details, but essential considerations to ensure the trust would function effectively beyond emotional response to my current circumstances. We should involve Davis Franklin from the Historical Preservation Society, I suggested, thinking of a former colleague whose expertise in historical property management might provide valuable guidance. And perhaps Rebecca Martinez from the Teachers Retirement Association could advise on specific needs among retired educators seeking affordable housing. Margaret's expression reflected growing appreciation for the thoughtfulness behind what might have initially seemed like an emotional reaction. This isn't something you've just conceived today, is it? The core concept has been in your mind for some time. Robert and I discussed similar ideas over the years, I acknowledged. We always intended the house to serve community purpose beyond our lifetime. We just assumed we'd have time to formalize those plans together, and then after his death, I expected my children might help implement something reflecting our shared values. The betrayal of that expectation hung unspoken between us, but Margaret simply continued with practical next steps. I can have preliminary trust documents prepared by tomorrow afternoon. We should also discuss immediate protection measures while the formal trust establishment proceeds. Before she left, Margaret provided clear guidance about handling my children's expected return for signatures on their routine documents. Be as natural as possible, she advised. Express interest in reviewing everything thoroughly, ask questions about specific terms or provisions, but don't reveal your awareness of their actual intentions or our counterplans. We need time to establish proper legal protections before they realize you've discovered their scheme. That evening, I experienced something unexpected amid the painful knowledge of my children's betrayal. A sense of purpose and clarity I hadn't felt since Robert's death. The housing trust concept resonated deeply with values I'd demonstrated throughout my career and personal life. It would create meaningful legacy from what might otherwise have been bitter family conflict, transforming potential loss into community benefit that honored both Robert's craftsmanship and our shared commitment to education. The next morning, Catherine called rather than visiting as planned. "Just checking if you've had time to review those documents," she said, her casual tone betrayed by underlying tension. "Michael and I need to file some of them with your insurance company soon." "I've been going through them carefully," I replied, maintaining calm neutrality. "There are several provisions I'd like to discuss in person. Would tomorrow morning work for both of you to meet here?" The slight pause before her response confirmed my suspicion that this request for a joint meeting had disrupted their strategy. "Let me check with Michael and get back to you," she finally answered. He has some important client meetings scheduled. Within an hour, Michael himself called, his tone reflecting the forced patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a difficult child. Mom, Catherine mentioned you had questions about the paperwork. They're really standard forms, nothing complicated or requiring extensive review. I can stop by this evening and walk you through anything confusing. I'd prefer we meet together. Tomorrow, I maintained firmly. Some of these provisions affect both of you, and I'd rather discuss everything at once rather than repeating the same concerns separately. My cognitive abilities remain perfectly intact despite my current physical limitations. This pointed reminder that temporary mobility issues didn't equate to diminished mental capacity created another telling pause before Michael conceded. Fine, we'll both come tomorrow at 10, but these really are routine documents that will simplify managing matters during your recovery. After ending the call, I contacted Margaret to confirm our timeline. They're coming tomorrow at 10. How much of the trust documentation can we have prepared by then? I've been working on it since leaving you yesterday, she assured me. The basic framework will be ready for your signature this evening. I've already spoken with Davis Franklin, who is enthusiastically supportive of the historical preservation aspects, and he's providing language ensuring the property's architectural integrity remains protected under the trust provisions. That evening, Margaret returned with preliminary trust documents and additional protection measures. I've also prepared a formal revocation of any previously granted permissions regarding your property, she explained. This explicitly nullifies any authority they might claim through casual conversations or implied consent during your rehabilitation period. As we reviewed the trust provisions, my determination strengthened. The Caldwell-Henderson Community Housing Trust would create affordable housing specifically for retired educators, with preference given to those who had served in public schools for at least 20 years. The property's historical features would be permanently protected through preservation easements, and its educational legacy would continue through community programs hosted in the restored reading room. This isn't just defensive action against my children's plans, I observed as I signed the preliminary documents. It's positive redirection toward something meaningful that might never have happened without this situation forcing concrete decisions, rather than someday intentions. Margaret nodded, understanding the complex emotions behind this observation. Sometimes betrayal reveals clarity about what truly matters. The trust creates purpose beyond personal ownership or family inheritance. It establishes legacy measured through community benefit rather than private wealth transfer. With the basic protection measures in place and formal trust establishment proceedings initiated, I prepared for the next morning's meeting with my children. The emotional weight remained profound, signing documents to formally protect my property. From my own children's unauthorized sale created a particular kind of heartbreak I had never anticipated experiencing. Yet, beneath that pain, a sense of purpose provided unexpected strength. At precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, Michael and Catherine arrived together, their coordinated appearance suggesting careful preparation for what they clearly viewed as an important financial transaction rather than family discussion. Michael carried an expanded portfolio of documents, while Catherine brought what appeared to be property listings disguised as rehabilitation literature. "Good morning, Mom," Catherine greeted me with practiced brightness. "You're looking much stronger today. The physical therapy must be working wonders." "It is indeed," I confirmed, gesturing toward the chairs beside my bed. "My physical recovery is progressing exactly as expected. Temporary limitation requiring specific therapy, but with excellent prognosis for complete restoration of mobility within another 4 to 6 weeks. This deliberate emphasis on the temporary nature of my condition and expected full recovery created a momentary exchange of glances between them before Michael smoothly redirected the conversation. "That's wonderful news," he said, opening his portfolio. "Now, about these documents we discussed. They're simply authorizations allowing us to manage practical matters during your continuing recovery. Nothing complex or permanent." I'd like to review them specifically, one by one, I responded, accepting the papers with deliberate care. My rehabilitation schedule includes cognitive exercises as well as physical therapy. Detailed document review provides excellent mental stimulation. For the next 45 minutes, I maintained the appearance of careful but naive review, asking questions about specific provisions while pretending not to recognize their actual implications. Michael and Catherine exchanged increasingly impatient glances as I methodically examined each page, occasionally requesting clarification about terms or purposes. This provision about management of real property assets, what specifically would that entail? I asked, pointing to a particularly expansive clause in the power of attorney document. Just routine maintenance decisions, Mom, Catherine explained with forced patience. Like if the water heater breaks or the roof needs repair, things you shouldn't worry about during recovery. And this section about liquidation of assets is deemed appropriate by the appointed representatives. What assets might that include? I continued, watching their reactions carefully. Michael stepped in, smoothly. That's standard legal language for flexibility in managing investments if market conditions change. Nothing that would affect your daily life or primary residence. The deliberate deception in this response, directly contradicting their actual intentions for immediate sale of my home, confirmed everything Margaret had discovered through her inquiries. They weren't just pushing boundaries or making well-intentioned but presumptuous decisions. They were actively, intentionally, misleading me about documents that would grant them authority to sell my home against my explicitly stated wishes. After completing my thorough review, I carefully gathered the papers and placed them on my bedside table, rather than signing as they clearly expected. Thank you for bringing these. Before making any decisions, I'd like my attorney to review everything, as well. Margaret Wilson has handled all my legal matters since your father's death, and I value her professional perspective. The mention of my attorney created immediate tension visible in both their postures. Michael recovered first, his voice maintaining professional smoothness, though his expression tightened noticeably. That's unnecessary, Mom. These are standard documents any family would use during medical recovery. Involving attorneys creates complications and expenses for routine matters. Nevertheless, I responded with calm firmness, I've already arranged for Margaret to review them this afternoon. She's been managing our legal affairs for over 30 years and understands my wishes regarding property and financial matters. Catherine attempted a different approach, her voice taking on the concerned daughter tone she had been practicing since my accident. Mom, we're just trying to make things easier during your recovery. These temporary measures prevent you from worrying about household management or financial details while focusing on rehabilitation. I appreciate that concern, I acknowledged, keeping my voice gentle despite the anger building beneath my calm exterior. And I'm grateful for your help arranging this excellent rehabilitation facility. The temporary nature of both my physical limitation and this residence arrangement is precisely why I want proper legal review of any documents affecting longer-term decisions. Their increasing discomfort became almost palpable as they realized their carefully orchestrated plan was encountering unexpected resistance. Michael made one final attempt, shifting to what I recognized as his closing technique from years of observing his business interactions. Let's approach this practically, he suggested, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. The house is sitting empty while requiring ongoing maintenance and expense. You're experiencing the benefits of professional support here at Oak Ridge. Rather than creating unnecessary legal complications, why not consider permanently transitioning to senior living? The proceeds from the property could ensure premium care for the rest of your life without any financial concerns. The directness of this statement, finally revealing their actual intentions without the previous pretense, might have been almost refreshing had it not confirmed the calculated nature of their deception. They had planned this outcome from the moment of my accident, viewing my temporary physical vulnerability as opportunity to implement permanent changes against my clearly expressed wishes. That's a significant decision deserving thorough consideration beyond temporary rehabilitation circumstances, I responded, maintaining composure through decades of practice handling difficult school administrative situations. For now, I'll focus on my recovery schedule while Margaret reviews these documents from a legal perspective. Recognizing they wouldn't achieve their immediate objective of securing my signature, Michael and Catherine reluctantly departed after extracting my promise to discuss options further once Margaret had completed her review. Their carefully neutral expressions couldn't quite mask their frustration at this unexpected delay in their plans. The moment they left, I called Margaret. To confirm our next steps, they presented exactly the documents you anticipated, I reported. Complete authority to sell the property disguised as routine maintenance management during recovery. I'm not surprised, she responded grimly. Based on what I've learned through further investigation, Catherine's firm has already created preliminary marketing materials for the property. They've even scheduled viewings for potential developers next week, apparently assuming they'd have your signature on these documents today. How quickly can we complete the trust establishment? I asked, the urgency of our timeline now abundantly clear. The preliminary protections are already in place through the documents you signed yesterday, she assured me. The formal trust recording will take another 2 to 3 days for proper filing. In the meantime, I've prepared notices revoking any implied authority they might claim regarding property decisions. These will be delivered to them formally this afternoon. That evening, I received almost simultaneous phone calls from both children, their messages expressing shock and confusion at the legal notices they had received. I allowed these to go to voicemail, following Margaret's advice to maintain communication distance until the trust establishment was fully completed. Their messages revealed volumes about their perspectives and priorities. "Mom, what is this legal notice about?" Catherine's voice demanded. "We're trying to help you, not hurt you. These formal legal actions are completely unnecessary and hurtful. Call me back immediately so we can clear up this misunderstanding." Michael's message took a different but equally revealing approach. "Mom, involving attorneys in family matters creates unnecessary complications and expenses. Whatever concerns you have about the property management can be addressed directly between us without formal legal notices or revocations. This approach damages trust and creates potential tax consequences you may not have considered." The fundamental disconnect revealed in these messages confirmed the wisdom of establishing formal legal protections, rather than attempting to resolve matters through direct discussion. Neither message acknowledged my right to determine my own property's future or recognized their attempted overreach in making these decisions without my knowledge or consent. The following morning, Margaret arrived with Davis Franklin from the Historical Preservation Society and Rebecca Martinez from the Teachers' Retirement Association. Together, we refined the trust provisions to ensure both historical preservation and practical functionality for its intended purpose. The carriage house could be converted into 2 efficiency apartments while maintaining its external historical appearance, Davis suggested, reviewing photographs of the property. And the main house could accommodate 4 separate units if we utilize the existing room divisions rather than attempting open-concept modernization. Rebecca provided valuable insight about specific needs among retired educators seeking affordable housing. Many retired teachers face significant housing insecurity, particularly those who dedicated their careers to public education in economically challenged districts. Their pensions often fail to keep pace with rising housing costs, forcing them to leave communities where they've taught for decades. As we incorporated these practical considerations into the trust provisions, the concept evolved from reactive protection to proactive purpose, establishing meaningful legacy that would benefit both the historical property and the educational community that had defined my life's work. By that afternoon, the basic framework was complete. The Caldwell-Henderson Community Housing Trust would preserve the Victorian's historical features while creating affordable housing for retired educators, with property management overseen by a board including representatives from both the Historical Preservation Society and the Teachers' Retirement Association. The original reading room would be maintained as community space for educational programs, honoring both the Henderson legacy and our family's commitment to teaching and learning. This creates something far more meaningful than either private ownership or commercial development, Davis observed as we reviewed the final provisions. It preserves architectural history while addressing current community needs, exactly the kind of adaptive reuse that sustains both buildings and neighborhoods. Rebecca nodded in agreement. And it provides affordable housing specifically for educators who have given their careers to serving others, often at significant financial sacrifice. That's a legacy with purpose beyond property value. As they departed to prepare final documentation, Margaret stayed behind to discuss how we would handle the inevitable confrontation with my children once they discovered the property had been irrevocably transferred to the trust. They will likely be angry, she acknowledged with characteristic directness. Possibly even threaten legal action claiming undue influence or diminished capacity due to medication or physical stress. We've taken precautions against those arguments. Through medical certification of your cognitive clarity and multiple witnesses to the trust establishment process. But emotional reactions may still be intense. I understand, I replied. The sadness of this reality tempered by conviction about the rightness of our actions. Their reaction will reveal whether their primary concern is truly my well-being or the property's financial value. Either way, the trust serves purpose beyond family conflict, creating community benefit rather than just preventing unauthorized sale. The next morning, I signed the final trust documents with witnesses, including my doctor, my physical therapist, and 2 administrative staff members from Oak Ridge who had interacted with me daily throughout my rehabilitation. This careful documentation established both my cognitive capacity and deliberate intention, protecting against potential challenges based on claims of impairment or undue influence. The property transfer is now officially recorded, Margaret confirmed later that afternoon. The Caldwell Henderson Community Housing Trust legally owns the Victorian on Maple Street, with binding provisions ensuring its preservation and dedicated use for affordable housing serving retired educators. A profound sense of peace accompanied this confirmation, not happiness, given the painful family circumstances that had precipitated these actions, but certainty about having transformed potential loss into meaningful purpose aligned with values I had demonstrated throughout my life. When should we inform Michael and Catherine? I asked, knowing this conversation couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The trust recording will become public record within 48 hours, Margaret explained. Given their active monitoring of the property's status through Catherine's real estate connections, they'll likely discover it independently by tomorrow afternoon. I suggest we prepare a formal letter explaining the trust's purpose and provisions, to be delivered simultaneously with their likely discovery through public records. The letter we drafted that evening reflected careful consideration rather than emotional reaction. It explained the trust's educational purpose, historical preservation provisions, and community benefit without directly accusing my children of attempted property seizure or unauthorized sale. The facts spoke for themselves without requiring explicit accusation. The Caldwell Henderson Community Housing Trust ensures the Victorian will continue serving educational purpose beyond private ownership, we wrote. This decision reflects values demonstrated throughout my career and your father's dedicated craftsmanship, creating legacy measured through community impact rather than financial asset transfer. The property will provide affordable housing, specifically for retired educators who have given their careers to teaching others, often at significant personal financial sacrifice. Margaret arranged for this letter to be delivered to both Michael and Catherine the following morning, timing it to coincide with the public recording of the trust documentation. Now, she said as we finalize these arrangements, we prepare for their response, which will likely be immediate and emotional, rather than reasoned or reflective. Her prediction proved accurate beyond even our expectations. By early afternoon, both children had arrived at Oak Ridge simultaneously, their coordinated appearance suggesting hastily arranged conference calls and emergency planning sessions following their discovery of the trust establishment. "What have you done?" Catherine demanded without preamble as they entered my room. "This trust nonsense is completely unnecessary and potentially irreversible without significant legal complications." Michael attempted a more measured approach, though his tightly controlled expression revealed similar anger beneath professional veneer. "Mom, establishing permanent trust arrangements during temporary medical recovery creates potentially damaging tax consequences and limits future flexibility without proper financial planning consideration." I allowed them to express their initial reactions without interruption, observing how neither mentioned the property's meaning, historical significance, or my clearly established wishes regarding its future. Their concerns focused entirely on financial implications and lost opportunity for proper asset management through sale and investment of proceeds. When they finally paused, expecting my defensive justification or emotional response, I replied, with calm clarity developed through decades of educational leadership. "The trust ensures the Victorian will serve meaningful purpose aligned with both the Henderson legacy and our family's educational values. It creates affordable housing for retired teachers while preserving historical architecture that would likely be destroyed through commercial development." "But that's not economically efficient use of the asset," Michael objected, revealing volumes about his perspective through this single statement. "The property represents nearly 80% of your net worth, which could be generating significant investment returns instead of being locked into a non-productive trust arrangement. Different perspectives measure productivity through different metrics," I responded simply. "The trust will provide affordable housing for educators who have served their communities, often at significant financial sacrifice. That productivity cannot be measured through investment returns or asset appreciation, but through lives improved and community strengthened." Catherine tried another approach, her voice shifting to concern rather than objection. "Mom, we're worried about your financial security. This decision eliminates your largest asset without proper consideration of long-term care needs or potential medical expenses." "My financial planning has always been conservative and thorough," I reminded her gently. "As you both know from annual family discussions, my retirement accounts and investments remain more than adequate for anticipated needs, including long-term care insurance established 15 years ago. The property represents heritage rather than required financial resource, something your father and I have consistently expressed throughout our ownership." As they realized their financial objections weren't gaining traction, Michael attempted more direct confrontation. "This feels like punishment for trying to help you transition to appropriate senior living. We were only considering options that would improve your quality of life while properly managing family assets." This characterization, framing their unauthorized sale preparations as helpful consideration rather than deliberate override of my clearly expressed wishes, created an opening to address the underlying breach of trust without accusatory language. "Understand you may have viewed your actions as beneficial from your perspective," I acknowledged carefully. "However, preparing to sell my home without my knowledge or consent while I was temporarily in rehabilitation demonstrated fundamental disconnection from values I've consistently expressed throughout my life. The trust simply ensures the property serves purpose aligned with those demonstrated values." The conversation continued with similar cycles of objection and explanation, their arguments focusing entirely on financial implications, while mine emphasized purpose, values, and legacy, beyond monetary measurement. Throughout this difficult exchange, I maintained calm certainty about the rightness of creating community benefit from what might otherwise have become bitter family conflict. Finally, recognizing they wouldn't change either my decision or the FIAMA now legally established trust provisions, Catherine shifted to what she clearly viewed as her strongest remaining argument. "What about family legacy? This decision removes any inheritance potential for future generations. Your own grandchildren will receive nothing from this property that's been in our family for decades. The genuine confusion in her expression as she made this argument revealed perhaps the most profound disconnect in our values and perspectives. In her worldview, legacy meant financial assets transferred to biological descendants regardless of their demonstrated interest in or commitment to the principles those assets represented. In mine, legacy meant values demonstrated through purpose that continued beyond individual ownership or family inheritance. Legacy isn't measured solely through private wealth transfer, I explained gently. The trust creates lasting impact aligned with values your father and I demonstrated throughout our lives, preserving history that matters, creating community benefit through personal resources, and supporting education beyond our individual life. Careers. Those values represent our actual legacy, which continues through purpose rather than property ownership. As they finally departed, frustrated but recognizing the legal finality of the trust establishment, I experienced complex emotions. Beyond simple vindication or satisfaction, sadness remained for the fundamental disconnection revealed through this situation, not just disagreement about a specific property decision, but profound difference in values and perspectives about what constituted meaningful legacy or appropriate family obligation. Yet beneath that sadness, certainty about the rightness of transforming potential loss into community purpose provided unexpected peace. The Victorian would continue standing on Maple Street, its historical features preserved rather than demolished for commercial development. Retired teachers who had given their careers to education would find affordable housing in an increasingly expensive community. The reading room where Edward Henderson had taught factory workers and where I had tutored struggling students would continue serving educational purpose beyond our individual lifetimes. Sometimes painful betrayal reveals clarity about what truly matters, creating opportunity for purpose beyond what might otherwise have remained comfortable but unfulfilled intentions. My children had seen only financial asset requiring proper management through sale and investment. I had recognized home embodying values worth preserving through purpose, extending beyond private ownership or family inheritance. The Caldwell Henderson Community Housing Trust transformed what might have been merely sad family conflict into meaningful legacy measured through community impact rather than asset transfer, creating affordable housing for educators who had served others, preserving historical architecture that embodied craftsmanship worth protecting, and establishing purpose aligned with values demonstrated throughout my life, and Robert's dedicated restoration work. My children put me in a nursing home to sell my house, but I changed the deed the night before, not from vengeful impulse or emotional reaction, but from clear recognition that legacy means purpose beyond property and value beyond market price. 3 weeks after establishing the Caldwell Henderson Community Housing Trust, I completed my rehabilitation program at Oak Ridge and prepared to return home. My recovery had progressed exactly as the doctors predicted, a temporary limitation, requiring specific therapy, but with excellent results restoring my mobility and independence. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very timeline my children had attempted to exploit had worked against their plans instead, giving me precisely the period needed to implement the trust while protecting my property from their unauthorized sale. Margaret arrived on my final morning at Oak Ridge, bringing not just transportation home, but news about the trust's remarkable development during those intervening weeks. The response has been extraordinary, she explained as we drove toward Maple Street. After the initial announcement in the local paper, the Teachers' Retirement Association has received over 40 inquiries from retired educators interested in the housing opportunity. Davis Franklin has already assembled a volunteer team of preservation specialists willing to advise on appropriate renovations, preserving historical features while creating functional living spaces. As we turned onto my street, I noticed several neighbors working in their front gardens, their activities suspiciously synchronized with our anticipated arrival time. Eleanor Thompson spotted us first, abandoning any pretense of gardening to wave enthusiastically and alert others to our approach. The Neighborhood Welcome Committee appears fully assembled, Margaret observed with amusement. Word of the trust. has spread quickly, and from what I've heard, most neighbors are delighted about the property's preservation rather than commercial development. Several were apparently quite concerned when they noticed development company representatives walking the grounds with Catherine last month. Before Margaret had even parked in my driveway, Eleanor was at the car door, her expression reflecting genuine delight at my return. "Virginia, thank goodness you're back and looking so well. We've all been taking turns watching over the house. Jim?" Kendall actually chased away some developer who tried to conduct soil testing last week without authorization. This image, my 78-year-old neighbor with his walker confronting trespassing developers, created such an incongruous mental picture that I couldn't help laughing despite the serious circumstances behind it. Eleanor accompanied us inside, where I discovered another surprise. The house had been immaculately maintained, fresh flowers adorned the entry table, and delicious aromas emanated from the kitchen. "We've established a rotation," Eleanor explained, noting my surprise. After word spread about the trust plan, neighbors organized a schedule to ensure everything was properly maintained. "Mrs. Abernathy is responsible for today's casserole. She remembered it was your favorite when Robert was ill." This spontaneous community response, neighbors rallying to support both me personally and the preservation vision for the property, provided unexpected validation beyond formal legal establishment. These weren't just adjacent property owners, but people who valued what the Victorian represented both historically and as potential community resource for educators. As I settled back into my home that afternoon, reacquainting myself with the spaces Robert and I had so lovingly restored over decades, something profound shifted in my perspective about the trust decision. What had begun as defensive measure protecting my property from unauthorized sale had evolved into community initiative with momentum beyond my individual circumstances or family conflict. Davis Franklin arrived the following morning with preliminary renovation concepts that would transform the Victorian into dedicated housing while preserving its historical integrity. His enthusiasm for the project was evident as he spread architectural drawings across the dining room table we had rescued from a salvage yard and painstakingly restored 30 years earlier. "The original room divisions work perfectly for our purposes," he explained, pointing to the floor plans. "The formal parlor, library, dining room, and downstairs guest suite can each become independent living spaces with minimal structural modification. The service staircase provides separate access to the upper floor, which can accommodate 2 additional apartments while maintaining the grand staircase as common architectural feature." What struck me most about his approach was the careful balance between historical preservation and practical functionality, protecting architectural elements that gave the home its character, while creating living spaces that would serve educators' actual needs, rather than merely showcasing period restoration. "The carriage house presents our greatest opportunity for innovation," Davis continued, turning to separate drawings. "While maintaining its external historical appearance, the interior can accommodate 2 modern efficiency apartments with excellent natural light and private entrances. The Preservation Committee has already identified grant funding specifically supporting this type of adaptive reuse project. As we discussed these plans, I realized something important was shifting in my relationship to the property itself. For 36 years, I had viewed it primarily as our home, the physical embodiment of life Robert and I had built together. Now I was beginning to see it through more expansive perspective as community resource with purpose extending beyond personal history or family ownership. This evolution wasn't abandoning the property's personal significance, but expanding its meaning to include future impact beyond private memories. The craftsmanship Robert had poured into restoring intricate woodwork, repairing stained glass windows, and preserving architectural details would continue benefiting others rather than being demolished for commercial development. The educational legacy that had first attracted us to the property, Edward Henderson's community reading room where factory workers had learned literacy skills, would continue through new service to educators who had dedicated their careers to teaching others. Rebecca Martinez from the Teachers Retirement Association joined us that afternoon, bringing specific insights about creating appropriate living spaces for aging educators with varying mobility needs and financial circumstances. Most of our potential residents worked in public schools their entire careers, she explained as, "We toured the property together. Their pensions haven't kept pace with rising housing costs, forcing many to leave communities where they've taught for decades. This creates not just housing insecurity, but profound displacement from professional and personal connections." Her practical suggestions: wider doorways accommodating potential mobility devices, bathroom modifications supporting aging in place, communal laundry facilities reducing individual apartment costs, balanced necessary adaptations with respect for the home's historical features. Rather than viewing preservation and functionality as competing priorities, she approached them as complementary considerations serving a unified purpose. The original Henderson Library would make a perfect community room, she observed as we entered the space where I had tutored struggling students throughout my career. Residents could host reading groups, educational workshops, or small gatherings while maintaining the room's historical purpose as learning environment. This creates community within the housing project itself, while honoring the property's educational legacy. By week's end, the Trust Board had been formally established with representatives from the Historical Preservation Society, the Teachers' Retirement Association, and the Neighborhood Council, along with Margaret and myself serving as founding members. Our first official meeting established renovation timelines, application procedures for potential residents, and community engagement approaches ensuring transparent communication throughout the project's development. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly word would spread beyond our immediate community, attracting attention from regional educational organizations and historic preservation advocates. The local newspaper ran a feature article highlighting the innovative approach to both affordable housing and historical conservation, which was subsequently picked up by several educational publications and preservation newsletters. "You've created a potential model for similar projects elsewhere," Davis noted during our second board meeting, sharing emails he'd received from preservation societies in neighboring communities. "There are hundreds of historical properties facing similar development, pressure that could potentially serve comparable community needs through thoughtful adaptive reuse. This expanding impact, beyond the immediate preservation of a single Victorian home toward potential paradigm for addressing both historical conservation and educator housing needs, brought unexpected dimension to what had begun as response to painful family circumstances. The trust wasn't just protecting property from unauthorized sale, but creating pathway for similar initiatives serving communities facing comparable challenges. Throughout these initial weeks of trust development, I had maintained minimal contact with my children, following Margaret's advice to allow emotional distance before attempting any relationship repair. Their initial angry reactions had evolved into uncomfortable silence, neither acknowledging the trust's community purpose, nor attempting to understand the values behind its establishment. Catherine's real estate colleague Helena Jensen provided occasional updates about their reactions, reporting that both appeared primarily concerned about lost asset value, rather than understanding the property's significance beyond financial metrics. "They keep talking about millions in potential development value being locked away in this trust," Helena shared during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "I've tried explaining the community housing benefit and historical preservation significance, but they seem fixated entirely on market value rather than social impact. This perspective, measuring property solely through potential profit rather than community purpose, revealed the fundamental disconnect that had created our conflict in the first place. It wasn't just disagreement about a specific house, but profound difference in values regarding what constituted meaningful use of resources or appropriate legacy beyond financial wealth transfer." Unexpected recognition. 6 weeks after establishing the trust, I received unexpected phone call from Evelyn Mercer, the education editor at the regional newspaper. "We're doing a feature series on innovative approaches to community challenges," she explained after introducing herself. Your housing trust for retired educators has attracted significant attention as model addressing both affordable housing needs and historical preservation concerns. Would you be willing to be interviewed about how this concept developed? My initial reaction was hesitation. The trust had emerged from painful family circumstances I wasn't eager to discuss publicly. Yet Margaret, who happened to be visiting, when the call came, offered perspective that shifted my thinking. The personal conflict behind the trust's establishment isn't what matters for their story, she observed after I explained my reluctance. What's relevant is the innovative solution addressing community needs. How repurposing historical property for educator housing creates multiple benefits beyond either private ownership or commercial development. After considering this distinction, I agreed to the interview with specific focus on the trust's purpose and community impact rather than the family circumstances that had precipitated its establishment. Evelyn arrived the following day with a photographer and architectural writer who specialized in historical preservation projects. "What inspired you to establish housing specifically for retired educators?" she asked as we settled in the garden Robert had designed with careful attention to historical Victorian landscaping principles. "Education has defined my life's work," I explained, focusing on values rather than family conflict. "For 40 years, I witnessed the dedication teachers bring to their classrooms despite often inadequate compensation and minimal retirement security. Meanwhile, this historical property faced potential demolition for commercial development, despite its architectural significance and community heritage. The trust addresses both challenges simultaneously, preserving an important historical structure, while creating affordable housing for those who've given their careers to teaching others." As our conversation continued, I found myself articulating the philosophy behind the trust more clearly than I had even during its establishment. This wasn't just about preserving a particular Victorian home, but about recognizing how resources we control can serve purpose beyond personal benefit or family wealth transfer. Historical properties embody craftsmanship and design principles increasingly rare in modern construction, I noted as we toured rooms Robert had spent decades restoring. Yet their preservation often depends on finding contemporary purpose that justifies their continued existence beyond museum-like showcase. Educator housing provides that purpose, honoring the Henderson legacy of educational contribution, while creating practical benefit for those who continue that tradition through their own teaching careers. The resulting article, published the following Sunday, framed the trust as innovative model addressing multiple community challenges through creative resource allocation. The headline, "Historic Preservation Meets Educator Housing, Innovative Trust Creates Model for Community Solutions," positioned the project as forward-thinking initiative rather than reaction to personal circumstances. What I hadn't anticipated was how widely this article would circulate beyond the regional newspaper's typical readership. Within days, preservation societies and educational organizations from several states had contacted Margaret requesting information about the trust's legal structure and implementation approach. The state teachers' retirement system featured the project in their monthly newsletter, generating additional inquiries from retired educators seeking similar housing solutions in their communities. "You've identified a need that extends far beyond our local situation," Rebecca observed during our next board meeting, sharing statistics about educator housing insecurity across the state. "There are thousands of retired teachers facing similar challenges, professionals who dedicated their careers to education without accumulating sufficient resources for secure housing in retirement. Meanwhile, historical properties in their communities face development pressure threatening architectural heritage and neighborhood character." This expanding recognition, from local initiative addressing specific property preservation to potential model for similar projects elsewhere, brought unexpected dimension to the trust's significance. What had begun as protective response to attempted property seizure had evolved into community solution with potential impact far beyond my individual circumstances or family dynamics. 3 months after the trust's establishment, we received Notice that the project had been selected for prestigious preservation grant specifically supporting innovative adaptive reuse of historical properties. The funding would cover a significant portion of necessary renovations, ensuring both appropriate historical conservation and functional housing creation without compromising either priority. This validation from national preservation authorities strengthens our approach, Davis noted as we reviewed the grant documentation. It establishes precedent for similar projects addressing dual purposes of historical conservation and community housing needs. As renovation work began that autumn, transforming the Victorian into dedicated educator housing while preserving its architectural significance, something remarkable emerged through the process itself. Retired teachers from throughout the community volunteered their time assisting with appropriate aspects of the project, cataloging historical elements, researching period-appropriate materials, documenting the renovation for educational purposes, even helping with basic preparation tasks suitable for non-professional participants. This isn't just housing being created for educators, Rebecca observed as we watched retired history teacher carefully documenting original hardware being temporarily removed for restoration. It's becoming a community project where educators themselves contribute their knowledge and skills toward creating their own housing solution. This collaborative dimension, beneficiaries becoming active participants in creating their own housing rather than passive recipients of charitable provision, transformed the project's character in ways I hadn't initially envisioned. The trust wasn't just addressing immediate housing needs, but creating community ownership and engagement that would sustain the project beyond initial establishment. Family evolution. Throughout this period of expanding trust development and community recognition, my relationship with Michael and Catherine remained strained. Their initial angry reactions had evolved into uncomfortable distance, communication limited to occasional terse messages about practical matters or family obligations. Neither had visited since my return home from rehabilitation, their absence reflecting continuing resentment about the trust decision that had prevented their planned property sale. What I hadn't anticipated was how public recognition of the trust's community value would eventually impact their perspective. Not through direct family conversation, but through external validation, forcing reconsideration of what the property represented, beyond personal inheritance or market value. The catalyst for this evolution came unexpectedly through professional channels rather than family connection. Michael's wealth management firm had recently established Community Impact Division focusing on socially responsible investment strategies, and the partner heading this initiative happened to read article about the Housing Trust in Financial publication discussing innovative approaches to community development. My colleague James Phillips contacted me yesterday with questions about the trust, Margaret reported during one of our regular update meetings. Apparently, Michael's firm is researching models for community investment strategies, and our educator housing approach caught their attention as innovative structure balancing preservation needs with practical social impact. The irony that Michael's own firm would professionally recognize value in approach he had personally rejected wasn't lost on either of us. Yet this external validation, completely separate from family relationship or personal history, created potential bridge across the values disconnect that had created our conflict initially. 2 days later, I received brief email from Michael requesting meeting to discuss the trust structure from professional perspective. His careful wording, framing the conversation as business interest rather than family reconciliation, reflected continuing emotional distance while creating opening for potential relationship repair through professional recognition. When he arrived the following afternoon, Michael's demeanor revealed the complexity of his position, professional interest competing with personal resentment, external validation, challenging internal narrative about my decision being emotional reaction rather than purposeful choice. Our Community Impact Division is developing models for socially responsible investments, he began, maintaining careful professional tone as we settled in the library where the trust board now held its meetings. The structure you've established here represents innovative approach to addressing both preservation concerns and community housing needs. This framing, positioning the trust as innovative investment model rather than rejection of his financial advice, allowed professional acknowledgement without requiring personal reconciliation or values alignment. It created bridge across the disconnect that had separated us without demanding either of us abandon our fundamental perspectives. The trust serves multiple purposes simultaneously, I acknowledged, accepting this professional framing without pressing for personal reconciliation before he was ready. It preserves historical property that would likely be demolished for commercial development, provides affordable housing for educators who struggle with retirement security, and maintains community character through appropriate adaptive reuse rather than new construction. Our conversation continued in this vein, discussing the trust's structure and community impact through professional lens rather than family dynamics or personal history. Michael asked thoughtful questions about implementation challenges, funding, mechanisms, and potential scalability beyond this specific property. I provided thorough responses focused on practical aspects rather than emotional significance, creating substantive exchange despite our unresolved personal tension. Near the end of our conversation, something subtle shifted as Michael's professional analysis gave way to more personal observation. The response from educators has been remarkable, he noted, gesturing toward the bulletin board where we displayed thank you notes from teachers who had applied for residence once renovations were completed. I hadn't considered how significantly housing insecurity affects people who've dedicated entire careers to education. This acknowledgement, recognizing dimension beyond financial metrics or market value, represented first tentative step toward understanding the values behind my decision rather than merely accepting its professional structure. It didn't indicate complete alignment with my perspective, but suggested openness to considering factors beyond pure financial analysis. As he prepared to leave, Michael paused briefly beside the architectural drawings showing renovation plans, preserving the Victorian's historical features while creating practical living spaces for retired teachers. Dad would have appreciated this approach, he observed quietly. He always valued craftsmanship with purpose beyond decorative display. This reference to Robert, acknowledging his values regarding meaningful craftsmanship rather than invoking him to support financial arguments, created emotional opening beyond our professional discussion. It didn't resolve our fundamental differences, but recognized shared connection to values Robert had demonstrated throughout his restoration work. He believed things built with care deserved preservation through continued purpose, I agreed, accepting this tentative connection without demanding fuller reconciliation. The trust ensures his craftsmanship continues benefiting others rather than being demolished for commercial development. Michael nodded slightly before departing with promise to share the trust's structural model with his firm's community impact division. This wasn't emotional reconciliation or complete values alignment, but it represented potential pathway toward relationship repair through professional recognition of purpose beyond personal disagreement. Catherine's evolution followed, different trajectory, emerging through her professional network rather than direct family connection. As renovation work progressed and the project received increasing recognition within preservation circles, several of her real estate colleagues became involved with similar adaptive reuse initiatives in neighboring communities. Your mother's approach is gaining significant attention within historical property circles. Her colleague Helena mentioned during industry gathering focused on development trends. The combination of preservation funding with social purpose creates viable alternative to standard development models for certain properties. Several preservation societies are exploring similar structures for historical buildings facing development pressure. This professional recognition, colleagues valuing approach she had personally rejected, created cognitive dissonance, challenging Catherine's narrative about my decision being merely emotional reaction rather than purposeful strategy. The growing community support and institutional validation suggested purpose beyond what she had dismissed as sentimental attachment to outdated property. Her initial response came through text message rather than personal visit. Professional. Acknowledgement without emotional reconnection. Several colleagues have mentioned the trust project. The preservation funding model is apparently being considered for other historical properties in the region. This limited recognition, focusing on financing mechanism rather than community purpose, reflected continuing values disconnect despite professional acknowledgement. Yet it created opening for potential relationship repair through shared recognition of the project's viability beyond what she had previously dismissed as impractical sentimentality. When Catherine eventually visited 3 weeks later, her approach combined professional assessment with tentative personal reconnection. "The renovation work is more practical than I expected," she observed as we toured spaces being transformed into educator apartments. "Davis has maintained historical features while creating functional living environments, more balanced approach than typical preservation projects." This acknowledgement, recognizing practical functionality beyond pure historical conservation, represented step toward understanding the trust's purpose wasn't merely sentimental preservation, but meaningful housing creation. It didn't indicate complete values alignment, but suggested recognition beyond her initial dismissal. As renovations progressed through winter into early spring, both Michael and Catherine gradually increased their engagement with the project, not through full emotional reconciliation, but through professional recognition of its community impact and implementation success. Michael's firm featured the trust model in presentation about innovative community investment structures. Catherine introduced preservation-minded clients to Davis for consultation about similar adaptive reuse possibilities for historical properties they owned. This evolution, professional acknowledgement gradually opening pathway toward personal reconnection, didn't resolve our fundamental values differences or heal the breach created by their attempted property seizure. But it established potential framework for relationship repair based on mutual recognition rather than demanded agreement. By the time the first educator residents moved into completed apartments that spring, our family relationship had established new equilibrium, not restored closeness but respectful distance with occasional meaningful connection through shared recognition of the project's value despite different perspectives on its significance. The Victorian on Maple Street had become something more significant than family property or potential development parcel. It now housed 6 retired educators who had dedicated their careers to teaching others, often at significant personal financial sacrifice. The original reading room where Edward Henderson had taught factory workers in the 1880s, and where I had tutored struggling students throughout my career, now served as community space hosting educational workshops, book discussions, and intergenerational learning opportunities connecting residents with current students and teachers. What had begun as protective response to attempted property seizure had transformed into community resource with impact extending far beyond my individual circumstances or family dynamics. The trust wasn't just preserving particular historical building, but creating model for similar initiatives, addressing both preservation concerns and educator housing needs in communities facing comparable challenges. Sometimes painful betrayal reveals clarity about what truly matters, creating opportunity for purpose beyond what might otherwise have remained comfortable but unfulfilled intentions. My children had seen only financial asset requiring proper management through sale and investment. I had recognized home embodying values worth preserving through purpose extending beyond private ownership or family inheritance. The Caldwell-Henderson Community Housing Trust transformed what might have been merely sad family conflict into meaningful legacy, measured through community impact rather than asset transfer, creating affordable housing for educators who had served others, preserving historical architecture that embodied craftsmanship worth protecting, and establishing purpose aligned with values demonstrated throughout my life and Robert's dedicated restoration work. My children put me in a nursing home to sell my house. But I changed the deed the night before, not from vengeful impulse or emotional reaction, but from clear recognition that legacy means purpose beyond property and value beyond market price. The trust now stands as living testimony to possibility of creating meaning from betrayal, purpose from disappointment, and community benefit from what might otherwise have been merely private loss. 1 year later, exactly 1 year after establishing the Caldwell-Henderson Community Housing Trust, we held a formal dedication ceremony in the garden Robert had spent decades restoring to its original Victorian design. The Japanese maple that had inadvertently precipitated this entire journey through my fall on that frosty morning had once again turned brilliant crimson, creating perfect backdrop for the gathering of residents, community supporters, and preservation advocates celebrating what the trust had accomplished. All 6 apartment units were now completed and occupied by retired educators with teaching careers spanning every level from kindergarten to university. The residents ranged in age from 62 to 84, their combined teaching experience representing over 2 centuries of educational service. Each brought unique perspective to our growing community, while sharing fundamental commitment to learning that made the Victorian truly feel like educational center rather than merely apartment building. Martha Reynolds, who had taught high school English for 38 years, now managed the community library program in the restored reading room. George Sanchez, a retired science teacher with woodworking skills that reminded me of Robert, had taken particular interest in maintaining the home's historical features, documenting each restoration decision for educational purposes. Elaine Wilson, who had spent her career teaching music in elementary schools throughout the district, organized weekly musical gatherings that brought neighbors into the community space for everything from classical performances to sing-alongs that bridged generational gaps. As I watched these educators create vibrant community within the Victorians' walls, something Robert had said during our early restoration work resonated with new significance. The best preservation isn't freezing eye, building in time but giving it purpose that honors its history while serving present needs. The trust had accomplished exactly this balance, maintaining historical integrity while creating living environment that addressed current community challenges. Davis Franklin, wearing the ceremonial bow tie he reserved for significant preservation achievements, had just completed his dedication speech highlighting the project's innovative approach to historical conservation. "This isn't preservation for museum purposes," he noted to appreciative murmurs from Preservation Society members. "It's adaptive reuse that respects architectural integrity while creating functional living spaces addressing real community needs." The Caldwell-Henderson model demonstrates how historical properties can remain vital through purpose aligned with their heritage rather than being either frozen in time or demolished for commercial development. Rebecca Martinez followed with perspective from the Teachers Retirement Association, her passion evident as she addressed the broader significance beyond this single property. "What we're celebrating today isn't just 6 apartments in a beautifully restored Victorian," she emphasized. "It's recognition that educators who dedicate careers to serving others deserve housing security in retirement." The Caldwell-Henderson model acknowledges that communities benefit from keeping retired teachers connected to the neighborhoods where they've invested their professional lives rather than being forced out by housing costs that outpace their pensions. As they spoke, I noticed Michael standing somewhat apart from the main gathering, his expression thoughtful as he observed the residents interacting with community supporters. He had arrived without Catherine, who had sent brief message about client emergency preventing her attendance, and maintained respectful distance while clearly paying close attention to the proceedings. When my turn came to address the gathering, I found myself setting aside prepared remarks for more spontaneous reflection on the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, this project began through circumstances I never anticipated, I acknowledged, meeting Michael's gaze briefly across the garden. What might have remained merely painful family disagreement has instead created community resource, serving purpose beyond individual ownership or private inheritance. This truthful framing, acknowledging the project's origins in family conflict without focusing on betrayal narrative, offered pathway toward healing without pretending complete reconciliation where fundamental values differences remained. It recognized reality without bitterness, purpose beyond painful circumstances that had revealed necessary clarity about what truly mattered. The Victorian now provides affordable housing for educators who dedicated careers to teaching others, I continued, gesturing toward the residents gathered beside the garden fountain Robert had salvaged from demolition site 30 years earlier. It preserves architectural heritage that would likely have been destroyed for commercial development. Most importantly, it creates community where intergenerational learning continues through programs housed in the very room where Edward Henderson taught factory workers in the 1880s. This represents legacy measured through impact rather than ownership. Purpose beyond property that continues serving educational mission across generations. Following the formal ceremony, guests toured the completed apartments and community spaces while residents proudly showcased both restored historical features and functional living environments. The balance achieved between preservation and practical housing creation impressed even skeptical developers who had initially questioned whether historical properties could be viably repurposed for affordable housing without compromising either architectural integrity or financial sustainability. As conversations flowed throughout the garden and house, several Preservation Society members approached with questions about implementing similar models in their communities. Davis had created detailed documentation of our process specifically for sharing with other organizations facing comparable challenges with historical properties requiring both preservation and practical purpose. The financing structure you've established is particularly innovative, noted preservation advocate from neighboring county, who was exploring similar approach for historic schoolhouse-facing development pressure. The combination of preservation grants, adaptive reuse tax credits, and affordable housing subsidies creates viable model that makes financial sense while serving dual purposes of historical conservation and community housing needs. This expanding impact beyond single Victorian on Maple Street toward potential framework for similar initiatives elsewhere, represented perhaps the most significant outcome of what had begun as protective response to attempted property seizure. The trust wasn't just preserving particular building, but establishing replicable approach that might save countless historical properties while addressing educator housing needs throughout the region. As the gathering continued, I noticed Michael gradually moving toward where I stood beside the garden gate Robert had crafted from salvaged materials 20 years earlier. His approach conveyed purpose beyond casual interaction, yet maintained careful restraint, suggesting continuing emotional complexity despite evolving perspective. Your remarks were gracious, he acknowledged, reference to my speech acknowledging conflict origins without accusatory emphasis. The project has clearly succeeded beyond what I anticipated when you first established the trust. This acknowledgement, recognizing implementation success without necessarily embracing underlying values, represented significant evolution from his initial rejection of the entire concept as emotionally reactive decision rather than purposeful strategy. It didn't indicate complete alignment with my perspective, but suggested professional recognition, separate from personal disagreement. Different perspectives measure success through different metrics, I responded, acknowledging this partial bridge while maintaining clarity about fundamental values differences. The trust serves multiple purposes simultaneously, preserving historical architecture, providing affordable housing, creating community benefit, establishing educational legacy. Financial return was never its primary purpose, but addressing human needs while conserving irreplaceable craftsmanship. Michael nodded slightly, his gaze taking in the gathering of residents, neighbors, and preservation advocates, now filling the garden Robert had designed with such careful attention to historical Victorian landscaping principles. Dad would appreciate seeing the house filled with people using it rather than just preserving it like museum, he observed, offering connection to Robert's values without abandoning his own financial perspective. This reference, acknowledging his father's emphasis on functional purpose rather than mere preservation, created momentary personal connection beyond professional assessment. It didn't resolve our fundamental differences, but recognized shared appreciation for aspects of Robert's approach to restoration work that had always emphasized use beyond display. As our conversation continued with careful navigation around still sensitive areas of disagreement, Martha Reynolds approached with excitement about literary programs she was developing in the community reading room. "We're establishing intergenerational reading circles connecting residents with students from Westridge Academy," she explained, unaware of my complicated history with Michael. "The historical connection is wonderful. Students studying in the same room where factory workers learned literacy skills 140 years ago, guided by retired teachers continuing educational mission beyond formal classrooms." Her enthusiasm, genuine educators' passion for creating learning opportunities, highlighted purpose beyond property that made the trust meaningful, regardless of continuing family tension. Whether Michael fully understood this dimension or simply appreciated professional implementation success remained unclear, but the project's impact transcended our personal disagreement about appropriate use of resources or family obligation. As the dedication event concluded and guests gradually departed, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable journey from that morning when I had fallen on frost-covered steps to this gathering celebrating what had emerged from potentially devastating betrayal. The path hadn't been direct or painless. Relationship repair with my children remained incomplete and perhaps would never reach full reconciliation given our fundamental values differences. Yet something profoundly meaningful had emerged from circumstances that might otherwise have produced only bitterness and loss. The Victorian now housed educators who had dedicated careers to teaching others. Its historical features remained preserved rather than demolished for commercial development. Its educational legacy continued through community programs connecting generations through shared learning experiences. When I finally retired to my apartment in the completely renovated carriage house, the space I had chosen for my own residence while converting the main house to educator housing, I discovered handwritten note Margaret had quietly placed on my desk during the celebration. Aristotle said, "Where your talents and the needs of the world cross, there lies your vocation." Today you demonstrated how purpose transforms property into vocation beyond ownership. Not merely preservation, but purposeful legacy. This perspective, framing the trust as vocation rather than merely property decision, captured something essential about what had emerged from painful circumstances. The project represented alignment between resources I controlled and purpose that transcended personal benefit or family inheritance, creating community impact that would continue beyond my individual life or private ownership. The ripple effect in the months following our dedication ceremony, the Trust's impact continued expanding beyond initial housing creation or historical preservation. What had begun as a response to attempted property seizure evolved into educational initiative with multiple dimensions beyond physical housing or architectural conservation. The community reading room, where Edward Henderson had taught factory workers, where I had tutored struggling students, and where Robert had meticulously restored original bookshelves and window seats, became vibrant center for intergenerational learning programs, connecting residents with current students and teachers. Martha's literary circles expanded to include writing workshops, historical research projects documenting neighborhood development, and educational seminars where retired teachers shared specialized knowledge with community members. "We're not just housing retired educators," Rebecca observed during board meetings 6 months after our dedication ceremony. "We're creating educational community that continues their teaching mission beyond formal classrooms. The residents aren't merely receiving affordable housing, they're actively contributing professional expertise through programs serving broader community needs." This evolution, from passive housing provision to active educational engagement, transformed the project's character in ways I hadn't fully anticipated when establishing the trust. The residents weren't simply beneficiaries of affordable housing initiative, but continuing educators whose collective expertise formed remarkable resource for community learning opportunities. Elaine's music program now included weekly lessons for neighborhood children whose schools had reduced arts education due to budget constraints. George established science workshop using the Carriage House workspace, where middle school students learned principles of physics and engineering through practical projects related to historical building technologies. Martha's literacy initiatives expanded to include English language classes for immigrant families recently settled in adjacent neighborhoods. The Victorian had become educational center, where teaching continued beyond formal retirement. Legacy aligned with both Henderson's original community literacy mission and my own career dedicated to expanding educational opportunity beyond traditional boundaries or institutional limitations. This expanded purpose attracted attention beyond local community or regional preservation circles. 6 months after our dedication ceremony, National Educational Journal featured extensive article about the trust model, highlighting innovative approach addressing both retired teacher housing needs and continuing educational mission through community programs. The Caldwell-Henderson model demonstrates how educational resources extend beyond buildings or institutional structures, the article noted. By creating affordable housing for retired educators while establishing community learning center, the trust harnesses teaching expertise that typically disappears from communities when housing costs force teachers to relocate upon retirement. This represents significant social capital preservation alongside historical architectural conservation. This recognition, framing the project as educational innovation rather than merely housing provision or historical preservation, brought inquiries from teacher associations nationwide facing similar challenges with retired educator housing security and community displacement. The trust had established replicable model addressing nationwide problem through local solution that might be adapted for communities across the country. Davis and Rebecca found themselves regularly consulting with organizations exploring similar initiatives in their regions, sharing our documentation, financial structure, and implementation approach. Within 18 months of our dedication ceremony, 7 similar projects had been established in communities facing comparable challenges, with both historical preservation and educator housing needs. You've created something that extends far beyond Maple Street, Margaret observed as we reviewed updates about these emerging initiatives during quiet dinner in my Carriage House apartment. What began as response to attempted property seizure has become national model addressing systemic challenges facing both historical preservation and educator retirement security. This expanding impact, from protection of single Victorian to potential transformation of how communities approach both historical conservation and educator housing, represented legacy beyond anything I had imagined when establishing the trust. During those difficult days following discovery of my children's planned property sale, what might have remained merely protective reaction had evolved into constructive model with potential national significance. The irony wasn't lost on me that Michael's wealth management firm had become actively involved in developing financial instruments specifically supporting similar initiatives through their community impact division. 6 months after our dedication ceremony, he had called to discuss potential presentation about the trust model for national conference focused on innovative approaches to community investment balancing social impact with financial sustainability. The combination of preservation grants, affordable housing subsidies, and educational program funding creates surprisingly viable financial structure, he explained, approaching the project from investment perspective that represented his worldview without necessarily embracing its underlying values. While not generating market rate returns, these initiatives demonstrate sustainable model addressing community needs while preserving historical assets that would otherwise face demolition for commercial development. This professional acknowledgement, recognizing implementation success within financial framework, didn't indicate complete reconciliation or values alignment. Michael still viewed the world primarily through investment metrics and market analysis. I continued measuring success through community impact and purpose beyond financial return. Yet his recognition of the model's viability from professional perspective created bridge across our fundamental differences without requiring either of us abandon our core values. Catherine's evolution followed different path, emerging through professional network rather than personal reconciliation. Her development firm had gradually increased involvement with adaptive reuse projects, focused on historical properties following growing market recognition of their potential value beyond traditional commercial redevelopment. The preservation community is establishing funding mechanisms making these projects increasingly viable from development perspective, she noted during rare visit 9 months after our dedication ceremony. While not matching returns from traditional development approaches, the combination of tax incentives, grant funding, and community support creates sustainable model for certain historical properties otherwise considered economically obsolete. This framework, measuring the project through market viability rather than community purpose, reflected Catherine's continuing perspective without necessarily embracing the values behind my decision. She hadn't abandoned her fundamental approach viewing property primarily through financial metrics, but professional recognition had created space for acknowledging implementation success despite different values orientation. By the second anniversary of the Trust's establishment, what had begun as protective response to attempted property seizure had evolved into educational initiative with significance extending far beyond personal circumstances or family conflict. The Victorian on Maple Street now housed 8 retired educators following carriage house expansion, creating 2 additional apartments. The community programs operated from the restored reading room served hundreds of community members annually. Through intergenerational learning opportunities connecting educational expertise with neighborhood needs. Most significantly, similar initiatives had been established in 14 communities nationwide, adapting our model to address comparable challenges with both historical preservation and educator housing security. Each implementation reflected local circumstances and specific community needs, but all shared fundamental approach combining historical conservation with practical purpose serving educational mission beyond individual ownership or private property. Concerns. The wisdom resolution as I watched this expanding impact from what my children had initially dismissed as emotionally reactive decision. Something profound shifted in my understanding of legacy beyond family inheritance or property transfer. The trust hadn't just protected Victorian from unauthorized sale, but created purpose extending far beyond what private ownership or individual possession could have accomplished. This perspective wasn't about vindicating my decision against my children's objections, but recognizing how clarity emerging from painful betrayal had created opportunity for purpose beyond what might otherwise have remained unrealized potential. The conflict had forced concrete action, implementing long-standing intentions that might have remained vague someday plans without catalyst requiring immediate decisions about what truly mattered. During quiet evening marking second anniversary of my fall that had precipitated this entire journey, I sat in garden Robert had created with such loving attention to historical detail and contemporary function. The Japanese maple that had inadvertently changed everything through frost-covered morning had once again turned brilliant crimson, its color deepening daily as autumn progressed toward winter. Martha joined me there, bringing tea and quiet companionship, reflecting the comfortable community that had developed among residents, beyond merely sharing physical space. I taught literature for nearly 4 decades, she observed, gesturing toward students gathering in reading room visible through windows Robert had so carefully restored. But I've never felt my teaching more meaningful than these past 2 years, connecting generations through shared learning experiences in that room. This isn't retirement, but continuation. Purpose beyond formal career that honors knowledge accumulated through decades of classroom experience. Her perspective, framing the trust as educational continuation rather than merely housing provision, captured essential dimension that transcended physical property or architectural preservation. The Victorian now served purpose aligned with both Henderson's original vision and continuing educational mission spanning nearly 140 years from factory worker literacy classes through contemporary intergenerational learning programs. When Michael visited the following week for quarterly board meeting focused on trust expansion possibilities, his professional assessment had evolved to include recognition beyond purely financial metrics. The social impact measurement frameworks we're developing suggest these initiatives generate significant community value beyond traditional return calculations, he noted, reviewing documentation tracking educational program outcomes and resident contributions through professional expertise application. This evolution, acknowledging value dimensions beyond financial return, didn't indicate complete abandonment of his market-oriented worldview, but suggested expanding perspective incorporating considerations beyond pure investment metrics. The bridge between our fundamentally different approaches had widened through professional recognition without requiring either complete values, convergence, or artificial resolution of continuing differences. Catherine's relationship to the project remained more distant, her engagement primarily through professional network rather than personal connection. Yet even her perspective had evolved beyond initial dismissal, her development firm now actively consulting on similar adaptive reuse initiatives where historical properties could serve community purpose while maintaining financial viability through creative funding mechanisms and tax incentive structures. The model you've established is gaining significant traction within specialized development circles, she acknowledged during brief visit coordinating historical consultant for similar project her firm had undertaken in neighboring community. While not replacing traditional development approaches, it offers viable alternative for specific properties where historical significance and community purpose align with available funding mechanisms. This professional acknowledgement, recognizing implementation success without necessarily embracing underlying values, maintained appropriate distance reflecting our continuing fundamental differences, while creating connection through shared recognition of the project's viability despite different perspectives on its significance. As the trust entered its third year, National Educational Foundation approached us with significant grant opportunity, supporting expansion beyond single property toward comprehensive program, potentially addressing educator housing needs throughout the region. The proposal would establish satellite locations using similar model in communities facing comparable challenges with both historical preservation and teacher retention concerns. What you've created extends far beyond housing provision or historical conservation, the Foundation representative explained during presentation to our board. You've established educational community where teaching expertise continues benefiting neighborhoods beyond formal classroom careers. This represents significant social capital preservation alongside architectural conservation, maintaining educational resources within communities that invested in these teachers throughout their careers. This framing, recognizing educational dimension beyond physical housing or historical preservation, captured something essential about what had emerged from painful circumstances that might otherwise have produced only bitterness and loss. The trust wasn't just protecting particular Victorian or providing specific housing units, but establishing model for how communities might better support educators while preserving both architectural heritage and educational expertise otherwise lost through retirement displacement. As I considered this expanding impact from what had begun as defensive response to attempted property seizure, something Robert had said during our early restoration work resonated with new significance. The true value of anything we create isn't measured through what it becomes during our lifetime, but through purpose it serves beyond our individual ownership or control. The Caldwell-Henderson Community Housing Trust had transformed what might have been merely painful family conflict into meaningful legacy, extending far beyond personal circumstances or individual property ownership. It preserved historical architecture that embodied irreplaceable craftsmanship, provided affordable housing for educators who had dedicated careers to teaching others, created community benefit through intergenerational learning programs, and established replicable model addressing nationwide challenges with both historical conservation and educator housing security. My children had placed me temporarily in nursing home to sell my house without my knowledge or consent, but I had changed the deed the night before their planned property seizure, not from vindictive impulse or emotional reaction, but from clear recognition that legacy means purpose beyond property and value beyond market price. Sometimes painful betrayal reveals clarity about what truly matters, creating opportunity for meaning beyond what might otherwise have remained comfortable. But unfulfilled intentions. The trust now stands as living testimony to possibility of creating purpose from disappointment, community benefit from what might have been merely private loss, and legacy measured through impact rather than inheritance. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I hope you'll consider something beyond the specific circumstances or particular property involved. What resources do you control? Physical, financial, intellectual, or relational, that might serve purpose beyond personal benefit or private possession? How might betrayal or disappointment in your own life reveal clarity about what truly matters, creating opportunity for meaning beyond comfortable intentions never quite implemented? Legacy isn't measured solely through what we leave to family or how much wealth transfers between generations. True legacy emerges through purpose our resources serve beyond our individual control or ownership. Impact continuing through lives, improved rather than assets transferred, community strengthened rather than market value maximized, meaning created rather than merely possessions preserved. My children put me in a nursing home to sell my house, but I changed the deed the night before. The trust I established that night has now created housing for dozens of retired educators, preserved historical architecture that would have been demolished for commercial development, established educational programs serving hundreds of community members annually, and inspired similar initiatives in communities nationwide facing comparable challenges. That's legacy beyond property. Purpose transcending possession, measured through lives improved rather than assets transferred. What might your legacy become if you recognized resources you control could serve purpose beyond personal benefit or family inheritance? The answer might transform not just your property, but your understanding of what truly constitutes meaningful legacy beyond market value or private ownership. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.